Under the shimmering Amalfi sun, the world felt suspended, caught between the pulse of the endless sea and the whisper of lemon-scented air that drifted over the ancient, winding streets. Natalie Reed stood at the edge of a limestone overlook, her hands gripping the cool stone, her heart tethered to 1,000 unspoken fears. Below her, the vibrant town of Positano spilled down the cliffs like a painting come to life. A mosaic of pastel buildings, narrow alleyways and tangled vines, heavy with blooms. Tourists bustled through the streets, their laughter and chatter rising to meet the warm Italian air, but to Natalie it all felt like a distant echo. She tilted her face toward the horizon where the sun bled into the sea, the colors too beautiful, almost cruel in their indifference to the chaos inside her. If beauty alone could fix what was broken, she thought bitterly, maybe she wouldn't be standing here trying to summon the courage to destroy her own life to save someone else's. Her phone buzzed for the 3rd time in 10 minutes. She knew who. It was without looking. The guilt curled inside her stomach, thick and heavy, but she refused to answer. Not now. Not when every word Carmen Reed had uttered over the past 2 weeks still rang in her ears like a sentence she couldn't escape. Marry Landon Harlow, Natalie. Save the agency, save our family. A merger dressed up as matrimony. A gilded cage presented as salvation. Natalie had seen the numbers herself. The mounting debts, the unpaid bills, the dwindling bookings at their family-owned travel agency back in Florida. She knew the business her grandparents had built was sinking fast beneath the weight of the modern world. She understood why her mother, desperate and proud, had clung to this solution like a lifeline. But knowing didn't make it easier to stomach. Natalie pushed off from the railing and walked aimlessly down the cobblestone path, her sandals slapping, softly against the stones. Every step felt heavier, each breath tighter. The plan was simple. Meet Landon's parents tomorrow night at a formal dinner, smile sweetly, charm them, and begin the slow, inevitable march toward a wedding that would bind her to a man she barely knew, much less loved. Landon Harlow. She had met him once, at a gala her mother had dragged her to 6 months ago. He had been everything Carmen adored in a man. Poised, polished, impeccably dressed. His smile had been courteous, his conversation correct. He had looked at Natalie like one might admire a valuable acquisition, appraising her worth against a ledger sheet only he could see. Natalie had smiled back. She had laughed at his dry, strategic jokes, and inside she had shriveled. There had been no spark, no thrill, no glimpse of something she could build a life around. Only duty, only expectation. Natalie found herself wandering toward a small plaza, where local artists displayed their paintings and ceramics, their bright colors vivid against the sun-washed stones. She paused in front of a canvas that captured the cliffs and sea with stunning clarity. The artist, a woman with silver hair and laughing eyes, caught Natalie's gaze and smiled warmly. Amore, she said simply, tapping the heart at the center of her chest. Natalie smiled back, but it was a hollow gesture. What did she know of love? Her parents' marriage had been a battlefield. Her mother sharp and demanding, her father distant and drowned in his work until he eventually drowned in a bottle instead. Love in Natalie's world was something promised and rarely delivered. It was safer not to expect it at all. But somewhere deep inside her, buried under the layers of cynicism and resignation, a small voice whispered that she wanted more. She wanted the messy, breathtaking, terrifying thing that real love could be. She wanted to be seen, not bought, cherished, not traded. The thought took root, stubborn and dangerous. As she turned back toward her hotel, the idea crystallized in her mind. A plan so reckless, so wild, it made her stomach flip. If Landon wanted a perfect bride, pristine and obedient, then she would make herself anything but. She would create a scandal so undeniable that even Carmen Reed could not sweep it under the rug. She would destroy the careful image her mother had spent years curating, and in doing so, she would save herself. Natalie walked faster now, the decision giving her a strange, exhilarating kind of strength. She didn't need forever. She didn't need a fairy tale. She needed one night. One mistake that would blow the whole house of cards down. She would find someone, anyone, willing to play the part of her beautiful disaster. And tomorrow, when she sat across from Landon Harlow's perfect parents, she would no longer be the virginal prize they were bargaining for. She would be untouchable. The thought was terrifying. It was liberating. Back in her small hotel room overlooking the water, Natalie stood at the window, watching the stars blink into existence one by one. Somewhere out there, someone was living the kind of life she had always dreamed of. Wild, free, unbound by chains she had been too afraid to break. Tomorrow her life would be decided if she did nothing. Tonight she could choose. Natalie let the sea air fill her lungs. She threw on a pair of worn jeans and a loose flowing top. She braided her hair back, practical and simple. No makeup. No masks. She wasn't going out to impress anyone. She was going out to destroy a future she had never chosen. The streets of Amalfi at night were a different kind of beautiful, mysterious, electric, alive. Strings of lights crisscrossed the alleyways, illuminating lovers tucked into shadowed doorways and friends laughing over glasses of red wine. The scent of roasting garlic and fresh basil teased her senses. She moved through the throng like a ghost, unseen, unnoticed. Her heart pounded so loudly she could feel it in her fingertips. At a small bar tucked between two leaning stone buildings, she found her battleground. It was dim, cozy, filled with the low murmur of conversation and the clink of glassware. A guitarist strummed a slow, mournful tune in the corner, and the bartender served wine and grappa with equal solemnity. Natalie slid onto a stool at the end of the bar, ordered a drink she didn't really want, and scanned the room. Men and women, couples and strangers, laughter and flirtation hanging thick in the air. She needed someone who wouldn't ask questions, someone who didn't know her past or her future. Her fingers tapped a nervous rhythm against the bar top. Maybe this was a mistake. Maybe. Then she saw him. He was leaning against the far wall, his beer untouched in front of him, his head bowed as he scrawled something on a battered notebook. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a simple black t-shirt and jeans. His hair was a little too long, curling at the edges, and his skin bore the golden kiss of too many days spent under the sun. He looked up, almost as if he could feel her staring. Their eyes met across the room. His gaze was steady, curious, unguarded. Natalie's heart stuttered. There was no calculation in his look, no appraisal, no judgment. Just a man and a woman on the edge of something neither of them fully understood. Natalie slid off her stool, her legs trembling but sure, and crossed the room before she could lose her nerve. He watched her approach, the ghost of a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. When she stopped in front of him, words tangled on her tongue. "Hi," she said finally, breathless. "Hi," he answered, his voice low and warm. Close up, his eyes were a startling green, flecked with gold, like the sun-drenched hills outside the town. "I'm Natalie," she said, feeling foolish, feeling alive. "Jake," he replied, setting the notebook aside. There was a pause, a heartbeat, a moment where anything could happen. "I need your help," Natalie blurted, the words tumbling out in a rush. "I need you to pretend, just for tonight, that you and I are—" She broke off, flushing. Jake arched an eyebrow, amused but not mocking. "Are what?" "Together," she whispered. "Something complicated, messy, scandalous." Jake studied her for a long moment. He seemed to weigh something in the air between them, something invisible and heavy. Then he smiled, slow and sure. "Okay," he said simply. "Let's make a little mess, Natalie." And just like that, the course of her life shifted. Not with a thunderclap, not with a grand gesture, but with a simple agreement between two strangers under the forgiving stars of Amalfi. Natalie didn't know then that Jake Carter was more than he seemed, that behind his easy smile and steady hands lay secrets deeper and more tangled than her own. All she knew was that for the first time in months, maybe years, she wasn't running away. She was running towards something, something dangerous, something exhilarating, something real. As they slipped out into the night together, laughter already chasing their heels, Natalie Reid didn't look back. Tomorrow would bring whatever it would bring. Tonight she would choose freedom. The streets of Amalfi after dark transformed into something almost otherworldly. The daylight crowds had dispersed, leaving behind a softer, dreamier cityscape lit by strings of golden lights and the warm, welcoming glow of trattorias spilling music and conversation into the night air. Natalie Reid moved through the winding alleys with a sense of quiet determination, the ocean breeze tugging playfully at the hem of her dress. Her heart was still a chaotic drumbeat in her chest, but the weight of her decision earlier at the overlook now carried a new kind of energy, a reckless, intoxicating sense of freedom. The small bar she and Jake had found themselves in wasn't the kind of place you stumbled into by accident. Tucked down a crooked alley with only a flickering lantern above the door to mark its presence, it had the air of a secret, something you had to earn by knowing it existed. Inside it was dim and cozy, the low ceiling crisscrossed with dried herbs and string lights. A man played a battered guitar near the fireplace, and a few locals murmured over glasses of deep red wine. It wasn't the kind of scene that screamed scandal, but it was intimate enough for what Natalie needed. To disappear into the night, to leave behind the Natalie Reed that everyone else expected her to be. Jake Carter, or whatever pieces of him. He was offering tonight, followed her to a small table in the corner. He was so easy in his skin, moving with the quiet confidence of a man who didn't need to prove anything to anyone. Natalie envied that ease. She was nothing but a tangle of second guesses and conflicting loyalties, and tonight she wanted just, for a few hours, to borrow a little of his freedom. They sat opposite each other, their knees brushing under the rickety table. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Natalie's hands fidgeted with the paper napkin in front of her, while Jake simply watched her, his green eyes calm and unreadable. "You don't have to tell me why," he said finally, his voice cutting gently through the haze of her panic. "Whatever this is, whatever you need, I'm here." The simplicity of it undid her. No probing questions, no judgment, just a stranger. Offering a kind of silent understanding she hadn't realized she was starving for, she managed a shaky smile. "Thank you." The waiter came and went, leaving 2 glasses of cheap wine and a plate of olives. Natalie took a sip, grateful for the burn in her throat. It grounded her, pulled her back from the edge. "So," Jake said, leaning back in his chair, a teasing glint lighting his features. "What's our story?" Natalie blinked. "Our story?" He shrugged. "If we're going to be scandalous, we should at least get our facts straight. Were we childhood sweethearts? Star-crossed lovers? A torrid vacation fling?" The question was ridiculous and yet impossibly kind. Natalie laughed, the sound surprising even herself. The tension in her chest loosened another fraction. "Let's keep it simple," she said, playing along. "We met 2 nights ago. Fell madly in love. Couldn't stay away from each other. Completely reckless." Jake grinned, flashing a row of straight white teeth that made her stomach flip. "Sounds plausible." They spent the next hour crafting their fake history. Natalie found herself embellishing. Outrageous details. How they had danced in the rain. How they had carved their names into the cliffs overlooking the sea. How they had made solemn vows under the stars. Jake added his own flourishes with a straight face, claiming they had shared a single gelato cone and known from that first taste that they were meant to be. It was ridiculous. It was liberating. It was the first time in what felt like forever that Natalie wasn't burdened by the crushing weight of expectations. Between sips of wine and fits of laughter, they built a world that belonged only to them, a fragile, beautiful lie spun from the ruins of her real life. At some point, Jake's hand brushed hers as he reached for an olive, and the contact sent a jolt of awareness racing through her. She pulled back instinctively, but not before she saw the flicker of something raw cross his face. She hadn't come here for this. She hadn't come here to feel. But sitting across from Jake Carter, Natalie felt more seen than she ever had under the blinding scrutiny of Landon Harlow's polished, evaluating gaze. Jake didn't look at her like a prize to be won or a solution to a problem. He looked at her like she was a person. Messy, complicated, worthy. The thought terrified her. When the bar began to empty out and the guitar player packed up his instrument, Jake stood and offered her his hand. "Come on," he said, his voice a low rumble against the hushed background. "Let's get out of here." Natalie hesitated for only a moment before slipping her hand into his. Outside, the streets were quieter now. The lights seemed softer, the air cooler against her flushed skin. They wandered aimlessly, their steps in sync without conscious thought. At a small piazza, they paused to watch a group of local teenagers strumming guitars and singing old folk songs around a bonfire. Jake squeezed her hand gently. "Dance with me." Natalie shook her head, laughing. "There's no music." He tugged her closer, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Sure there is. You just have to listen." Before she could protest, he spun her under the stars. She stumbled, laughing, into his arms. For a moment, she let herself forget everything. Carmen, Landon, the looming threat of a future she didn't want. For a moment, there was only the warmth of Jake's hands, the solid comfort of his chest, the way he looked at her like she was the only thing worth seeing. Their bodies moved together easily, instinctively. Natalie wasn't a great dancer, but Jake didn't seem to mind. He guided her gently, patiently, laughing with her when she tripped, catching her when she faltered. When the song around the fire ended, they didn't let go. Jake rested his forehead against hers, his breath mingling with hers in the cool night air. "You don't have to tell me what you're running from," he said quietly. "But whatever it is, you're not alone tonight." Natalie's throat tightened painfully. It would be so easy to fall into this. to let herself believe, just for a little while, that someone else could carry her burdens, that she didn't have to be strong all the time, but she couldn't afford to forget why she was here. She pulled back slightly, searching his face. "Jake, would you kiss me?" The question hung between them, heavier than all the words they hadn't said. Jake's hand found her cheek, his thumb brushing gently over her skin. "Only if you're sure." Natalie nodded, her heart hammering against her ribs. His lips met hers, with exquisite gentleness, a question rather than a demand. She answered with her whole body, pressing closer, losing herself in the quiet fire of him. The kiss deepened, and the world around them faded into a blur of stars and salt and the faint, lingering notes of music. Natalie wasn't thinking anymore. She wasn't planning. She wasn't calculating the consequences. For the first time in what felt like forever, she was simply feeling. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathing hard, their foreheads resting together once more. Jake cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs tracing slow, reverent circles along her jaw. "Where to next, Natalie Reed?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. She smiled, a real smile, full of something fragile and new. "Wherever the night takes us." They walked down to the beach, shedding shoes and dignity alike. The sand was cool beneath their feet, the water licking at their ankles. They waded into the surf, laughing like children, splashing each other until they were both soaked and breathless. Later, they collapsed onto the sand, staring up at the endless sprawl of stars. Jake lay beside her, close but not touching, his presence a warm, steady heartbeat against the vastness of the night. Natalie turned her head to look at him, memorizing the way the moonlight silvered his hair, softened the hard lines of his face. She knew somehow that tonight wasn't about ruining herself. It wasn't about scandal or rebellion. It was about reclaiming something she had thought she had lost, herself. Jake didn't reach for her. He didn't push or pull. He simply lay there, offering her the simple, radical gift of his company. And Natalie, for once, allowed herself to accept it. Tomorrow, the real world would come crashing back in. Tomorrow, she would have to face her mother, her fiancé, her future. But tonight, under the vast, forgiving sky, she was free. She closed her eyes and let the waves sing her to sleep, the warmth of Jake beside her the only anchor she needed. And for the first time in a long, long while, Natalie Reed dreamed not of escape, but of possibility. The sun had barely begun to crest the hills behind Amalfi when Natalie Reed stirred awake, her body cocooned in the warm embrace of morning mist and the lingering scent of salt water. She lay still for a moment, the cool sand beneath her back grounding her to the reality of the night before. The stars had faded into a watercolor sky streaked with soft hues of pink and gold, and somewhere close by, the gentle lap of the waves against the shore was a steady heartbeat. She turned her head slowly and found Jake Carter lying beside her, his eyes closed, his chest rising and falling in an easy, peaceful rhythm. A lock of hair had fallen across his forehead, and Natalie fought the irrational urge to reach out and brush it away. Instead, she watched him, her heart a turbulent mix of gratitude and fear. Last night had been reckless. Last night had been madness. And yet, lying here under the breaking dawn with a man she barely knew, Natalie felt safer than she had in years. Jake stirred, sensing her gaze, and blinked up at her with a slow, lazy smile that sent a fresh ripple of confusion through her chest. "Good morning," he said, voice rough from sleep. Natalie smiled back instinctively. "Good morning." They sat up slowly, brushing sand from their clothes, the spell of the night lifting but not entirely breaking. Natalie pulled her knees to her chest, resting her chin on them, suddenly unsure what to say now that daylight had brought their escapade into harsher clarity. Jake didn't push. He simply sat beside her, letting the silence stretch comfortably between them. It was Natalie who broke it first. "Thank you," she said quietly. Jake tilted his head, studying her. "For what?" "For not asking questions. For not taking advantage." She laughed softly, shaking her head at herself. "For just being here." Jake's mouth twisted into something that wasn't quite a smile. "You didn't need saving, Natalie. You needed space. Sometimes that's the bravest thing anyone can offer." His words hit her harder than she expected. In a world that constantly demanded more, Jake had simply been there. No expectations, no demands, no hidden agenda. She turned to face him fully. "Last night was supposed to be a way out," she admitted. "A way to ruin everything my mother's trying to force on me." Jake leaned back on his hands, his expression open and patient. And now, he asked. Natalie exhaled, the breath shaky. Now, I don't know. I don't feel ruined. I feel alive. Jake chuckled, the sound low and warm. Alive's a good place to start. They sat there until the sun was fully above the horizon, until the beach began to stir with early risers and fishermen, readying their boats. It should have felt awkward, the way the world resumed its steady rhythm while she and Jake remained frozen in the aftershock of a single extraordinary night. But it didn't. It felt inevitable. Eventually, Jake stood and offered her a hand, pulling her easily to her feet. Come on, he said. Let's find some breakfast, I'm starving. Natalie laughed, brushing sand from her jeans. I think I still have half the beach stuck to me. Jake flashed her a grin. You wear it well. They wandered back into town barefoot, Jake carrying their shoes slung over one shoulder. The streets were mostly empty, bathed in the soft gold of early morning. A bakery had just opened its doors and the smell of fresh bread and sweet pastries filled the air. They bought 2 warm croissants and a bottle of fresh orange juice, finding a quiet stone bench to share their simple feast. For a while they talked about nothing. Travel stories, favorite foods, silly childhood dreams. Natalie learned that Jake had spent the last 2 years drifting from place to place, chasing waves and sunsets, leaving behind a world he no longer fit into. She didn't ask for more, sensing that beneath his easy smile lay truths he wasn't ready to share. Just as she knew she wasn't ready to spill every wound and fear knotted inside her own heart. It was enough for now to simply exist together. After breakfast, they wandered the town in a content, aimless haze. Natalie showed Jake her favorites, hidden corners. A tiny bookstore tucked behind a flower stall. A crumbling old church with mosaics that caught the sunlight and scattered it like jewels. Jake teased her mercilessly for her terrible Italian, and she retaliated by dragging him into a gelato shop where she made him order in Italian, laughing as he butchered every syllable. It was the kind of day that didn't fit neatly into the life she was supposed to return to. A day made of small perfect moments, stitched together with laughter and something deeper, something Natalie didn't dare name yet. As afternoon faded into evening, they found themselves back at the beach, sitting on a driftwood log, watching. The sky blush with the coming sunset. Jake grew quieter, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Natalie bumped her shoulder against his. Penny for your thoughts? He smiled faintly. Just wondering how long before you have to go back. Natalie's chest tightened. Tomorrow, she remembered. Tomorrow she was expected to sit across from Landon Harlow and his gleaming perfect family, and smile like a woman thrilled to be bartered into a lifetime of obligation. The thought made her feel sick. Jake must have seen something on her face because he turned fully toward her, his expression serious. You don't have to, he said simply. She blinked. Don't have to what? Go back. Marry him. Be who they want you to be. Natalie's laugh was brittle. It's not that simple. Jake didn't argue. He just looked at her in that steady, unflinching way of his, as if willing her to believe it could be. You're stronger than you think, Natalie, he said softly. You're braver than you know. Tears stung her eyes, unexpected and unwelcome. She swiped at them angrily. You barely know me, she said, her voice trembling. Jake smiled, something aching and real in it. I know enough. He reached into his back pocket and pulled out a small worn seashell. It was nothing special, chipped and faded, but he placed it in her palm with a kind of reverence. For luck, he said. In case you forget. Natalie closed her fingers around the shell, her throat too tight for words. The sky burned brilliant orange and deep indigo around them, and for one fleeting perfect moment, Natalie let herself imagine a different future. One where she chose herself, one where she wasn't a pawn in someone else's game, one where Jake's hand was always there to catch her if she stumbled. But reality loomed, as relentless and inevitable as the tide. She stood slowly, pocketing the shell. I should go, she said, hating how small her voice sounded. Jake stood too, but he didn't reach for her. He didn't plead. He simply nodded. Will I see you again, he asked. Natalie hesitated, her heart cracking clean down the middle. I don't know, she whispered. And then she turned and walked away, each step a battle against the part of her that wanted nothing more than to stay. As she disappeared into the narrowing alleys of Amalfi, the seashell warm against her palm, Natalie promised herself one thing. No matter what happened tomorrow, she would remember this night. She would remember what it felt like to be free, to be alive. And maybe, just maybe, she would find her way back to it again someday. Natalie's steps echoed down the narrow cobbled streets as she moved away from Jake, but every fiber of her being screamed against the distance. She could still feel him behind her, standing on the beach, probably watching her go. Each footfall seemed heavier than the last, weighted with the ache of unfinished moments, of words that had been left unspoken. She didn't want to leave like this, not with the memory of his hand slipping that battered seashell into hers, not with the ghost of his fingertips still brushing her skin. But what choice did she have? Up ahead, the town square was coming to life again, the evening buzz returning in full force. Couples drifted hand in hand beneath the lanterns. Street performers tuned their instruments. The smells of roasting meat and rich wine curled into the night air. Natalie ducked into a side alley, pressing her back against the cool stone wall. She drew a shaky breath, squeezing the seashell so tightly her palm ached. Was this really her only path forward? Returning to a life she no longer recognized, promising herself to a man she barely knew, just to satisfy debts and expectations that weren't hers to carry. The thought made her stomach churn. Natalie had always been the dutiful daughter, the dependable one, the dreamer who tucked her dreams away neatly when they no longer seemed convenient for everyone else. When her father left, when the agency faltered, when her mother's world became too heavy to bear alone, it was Natalie who stepped in. Natalie who stayed. Natalie who sacrificed quietly and without complaint. But standing here in the shadows, clutching a seashell given freely and without expectation, she realized something she had never dared admit before. No one was going to save her if she didn't save herself. The realization struck like a lightning bolt. Painful, illuminating, absolute. She pushed off the wall and turned back towards the beach, her heart pounding with renewed urgency. She didn't know what she would say to Jake, or even if he would still be there, but she couldn't let this night, this moment of clarity, slip away into regret. The beach was quieter now. A few stray figures dotted the shoreline, couples wrapped in private conversations, old fishermen pulling nets from the shallows, and there, sitting exactly where she had left him, was Jake. His legs were stretched out before him, his hands braced. Behind him in the sand, his face tipped up to the stars. The sea breeze tugged at his hair, and he looked impossibly calm, as if he had all the time in the world to wait for her. Natalie's feet slowed as she approached, suddenly uncertain again. But Jake turned, sensing her presence, and the easy, beautiful smile that broke across his face unraveled whatever doubts remained. "You came back," he said simply. Natalie sank onto the sand beside him, close enough that their shoulders brushed. "I'm not very good at walking away," she admitted, her voice barely more than a whisper. Jake chuckled softly, his gaze returning to the dark stretch of ocean. "Neither am I." For a while, they just sat there, watching the tide creep slowly toward their toes. Natalie wanted to freeze this moment, to memorize the way the salt air clung to her skin, the low murmur of the waves, the solid, comforting weight of Jake beside her. But time, relentless as always, moved forward. "You deserve to be happy, you." "No," Jake said eventually, his voice low. "Not just useful, not just convenient." Natalie swallowed hard. "Happiness feels selfish." Jake turned to her, his face serious. "It's not. It's survival." She bit her lip, feeling the familiar swell of guilt rise inside her. "My family needs me." Jake's eyes softened. "But what do you need, Natalie?" The question shattered something inside her. Tears welled up, hot and stinging, and she hated herself for them. But Jake didn't flinch away. He reached out and brushed a thumb gently across her cheek, catching the first tear before it could fall. "You can love them," he said, "and still love yourself too." Natalie closed her eyes, letting the weight of those words sink into her bones. "I'm scared," she confessed. Jake smiled, not unkindly. "Good. That means you're about to do something brave." She opened her eyes and met his gaze, seeing the truth reflected there. Jake wasn't promising her a fairy tale. He wasn't promising that choosing herself would be easy or even painless, but he was showing her that it was possible, and somehow, that was enough. The tide surged forward, soaking their feet, and they both laughed, startled by the sudden cold. Natalie leaned into Jake's side, resting her head on his shoulder, and for a long moment, they simply breathed together. No expectations, no demands, no plans. Just two souls adrift, finding temporary shelter in each other. As the night deepened, they walked back through the town, their hands brushing occasionally but never fully entwining. They talked about nothing and everything. Favorite books, worst dates, bucket lists left half finished. Natalie learned that Jake had once dreamed of becoming a marine biologist, that he loved thunderstorms, that he hated the taste of black licorice but kept trying it anyway just to be sure. Jake learned that Natalie collected postcards from every place she visited, that she secretly loved cheesy romance novels, that she was terrified of heights but had once skydived just to prove herself wrong. Each revelation was a thread, weaving a fragile tapestry between them. Eventually, they found themselves at the edge of town, where the lights gave way to open sky and the air smelled purely of sea and earth. Jake stopped, turning to face her fully. "I don't want to make this harder for you," he said, his voice raw. "I don't want to be another weight you have to carry." Natalie reached up and traced the line of his jaw with trembling fingers. "You're not a weight," she whispered. "You're the first breath I've taken in a long time." Jake closed his eyes briefly, as if the words hurt as much as they healed. When he opened them again, there was something fierce and unbreakable there. "You deserve to live, Natalie," he said. "Not just exist." The night wrapped around them, thick and full of possibilities. But somewhere in the distance, Natalie could already feel the pull of morning, the inevitable return to reality. She cupped Jake's face in her hands and pressed a kiss to his forehead, soft, lingering, full of all. The gratitude and sorrow she couldn't put into words. "Goodbye, Jake," she said, her voice cracking. He didn't try to stop her. He simply nodded, his hands dropping to his sides, his fists clenched tight against the desire to reach for her. Natalie turned and walked away, every step carving a hollow, deeper into her chest. This time she didn't look back, and even though her heart broke with every breath, she knew, she finally knew, that she was walking toward herself, not away. The weight of the coming day settled on Natalie Reed's chest before the sun had even risen over Palm Beach. She sat at the edge of her hotel room bed, the elegant fabric of her dress pooling around her ankles like a cage. The window beyond showed the endless sweep of the Atlantic, blue and glittering and utterly indifferent to the turmoil consuming her. Today was supposed to be the start of her new life. Today, she was supposed to smile sweetly and secure her family's salvation by marrying a man she barely knew. And yet the man she had thought she barely knew wasn't the stranger she had imagined. Jake Carter. No, Landon Harlow, even thinking his real name felt like betrayal, like a secret planted deep in the night that had only just been unearthed. Natalie buried her face in her hands. She hadn't been able to sleep after arriving back in Florida. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Jake's face under the starlight, the way he had looked at her, steady, open, real. She heard his voice telling her she deserved to live, not just exist, and now she was expected to stand across from him, dressed like a bride, smiling at him as if the truth didn't tear at the walls of her chest. A soft knock at the door startled her. "Natalie?" came her mother's voice, overly bright. "Are you ready?" Ready. Was anyone ever ready to betray themselves? Natalie stood on shaky legs, smoothing the satin dress she hadn't chosen, pulling her hair into the sleek chignon her mother preferred. She painted on a face that wasn't hers, foundation thick enough to hide the cracks, lipstick bright enough to distract from the tremble in her mouth. When she stepped into the hallway, Carmen Reed gasped, hands clasping in admiration. "Oh, darling," she breathed, her eyes shining with satisfaction. "You look perfect." Natalie nodded, a marionette pulled by invisible strings. Together they descended into the grand lobby of the Breakers Hotel, where the engagement luncheon was already in full swing. Everywhere Natalie turned, there were smiles sharpened to blades, champagne glasses raised in toasts that sounded more like funeral dirges. And there he was, Jake. Landon stood near a cluster of Harlow relatives wearing a tailored suit that seemed to cage his restless energy. He looked different here, stripped of the easy grace he had worn like second skin in Amalfi. Now he was all edges and angles, a prince in a prison of his own making. Their eyes met across the room. Natalie felt the air thicken, the ground tilt. He gave the smallest shake of his head, a warning, a plea, but it was too late. Carmen was already leading her forward, one hand gripping Natalie's arm in a death hold. "Smile," she hissed out of the corner of her mouth. Natalie obeyed, baring her teeth like an animal. Introductions blurred into white noise as she stood before the Harlow matriarch and patriarch, two statues carved from ambition and entitlement. They said the right things, commented on her elegance, her poise, her breeding. Natalie answered in the correct measured tones, her voice sounding foreign in her ears. Through it all, she could feel Jake's gaze burning into her, could see the tension in his jaw, the way his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. He was suffering too. Somehow that knowledge didn't comfort her. When the luncheon finally ended and polite applause rang out to celebrate the happy couple, Natalie escaped to the terrace. She needed air. She needed to remember how to breathe. The ocean stretched endlessly before her, achingly close and impossibly far away. She gripped the iron railing until her knuckles turned white. "You don't have to do this." Jake's voice was quiet just behind her. Natalie closed her eyes, fighting the rush of emotion that threatened to spill over. She turned slowly to face him. Up close, he looked as wrecked as she felt. His tie was loosened, his hair mussed from raking his hands through it too many times. His green eyes, usually bright with mischief, were clouded with pain. "I can't," she whispered. "I can't ruin my family." Jake stepped closer, hands shoved deep in his pockets. "You're not ruining them. You're saving yourself." "And what about everything they've sacrificed for me?" she asked, her voice rising, brittle and sharp. "What about my brother's education, the agency?" Jake shook his head. "You can't pay back their sacrifices by sacrificing yourself." Tears pricked at her eyes. She hated him for being right. Hated him for seeing her so clearly when she had spent her entire life trying to be invisible. "I don't have a choice," she said, each word a stone falling from her lips. Jake reached out then, his hand brushing her arm, feather-light. "You always have a choice," he said, voice breaking. "You just have to be brave enough to take it." The door to the terrace swung open, and Carmen appeared, face flushed with excitement. "There you are," she trilled, oblivious to the tension crackling in the air. "Come. The photographer is ready for the formal portraits." Natalie looked at Jake one last time, memorizing the way he looked at her, like she was the only thing that mattered in a world full of noise and expectation. Then she followed her mother back inside, leaving a part of herself behind on the terrace. The photo session was a blur of stiff poses and empty smiles. Natalie stood beside Jake, their shoulders touching, the cameras flashing like gunfire. And the entire time, her heart screamed, "This isn't right." But no one else seemed to hear it, as Aile Ai. The afternoon bled into evening. The engagement party moved to the hotel's ballroom. Twinkling lights draped the ceiling, and a jazz quartet played soft, elegant music. Natalie drifted through the crowd, accepting congratulations she didn't feel, sipping champagne she didn't taste. Across the room, Jake watched her with a hollow expression. When it was time for their first official dance, he crossed the floor toward her, offering his hand. She placed hers in his, their fingers intertwining naturally. They moved together slowly, a perfect picture of grace and happiness for the watching guests. But beneath the surface, every step was a battle. "You could leave with me," Jake murmured, his lips barely moving. "Right now." Natalie's chest ached. "Where would we go?" she whispered back. "Anywhere," he said fiercely. "Anywhere you want." Tears blurred her vision. "I can't," she choked out. "I'm not that brave." Jake pulled her closer, his hand splayed against the small of her back. "You are," he said. "You just don't believe it yet." The song ended, and polite applause filled the room. Natalie curtsied mechanically, Jake bowing beside her, and then the tide of well-wishers swept them apart. Natalie found herself standing alone near the edge of the ballroom, watching Jake disappear into the crowd. She felt hollowed out, a vessel scraped clean of hope. Somewhere in the distance, her mother laughed. Her brother clinked glasses with new acquaintances, and the world spun on as if Natalie hadn't just lost something vital and irreplaceable. She slipped away from the party unnoticed, her feet carrying her through the winding halls of the hotel until she found herself back on the beach. The night was cool and dark, the ocean a restless mirror reflecting the fractured stars above. Natalie sank onto the damp sand, pulling the battered seashell from her pocket. She traced its ridges with trembling fingers. She didn't know how long she sat there, lost in thought. Long enough for the music from the hotel to fade to a distant hum. Long enough for the stars to shift positions overhead. And then, somewhere deep inside, she made a decision. A real one. Not one dictated by guilt or obligation or fear. A decision born from the wild, stubborn flame Jake had seen inside her all along. Natalie Reed stood, brushed the sand from her dress, and walked back toward the life she was about to change forever. The storm began in Natalie Reed's chest long before the first raindrops splattered. The marble steps of the Breakers Hotel. In the grand ballroom behind her, the engagement party spiraled toward its inevitable glittering climax. Laughter ricocheted off the chandeliers, champagne flowed like liquid gold, and somewhere in the midst of it all, her mother Carmen orchestrated her daughter's future with military precision. Natalie stood on the edge of it all, invisible and suffocating. She pressed her palms flat against the cool surface of the marble railing, willing the ocean air to steady her. But the night pressed heavy against her ribs, and every breath tasted like a lie she could no longer swallow. From the corner of her eye, she saw Jake, no Landon, moving through the crowd. His tie was loosened, his hair disheveled by restless fingers. He smiled when spoken to, shook hands when necessary, but his eyes kept seeking hers across the glittering expanse, tethering her to him in a way she couldn't explain. He hadn't pushed. He hadn't begged. He had offered her freedom, and she was the one too afraid to reach for it. A sharp gust of wind whipped strands of hair from her updo, and Natalie shivered. The decision she had made out there on the beach still pulsed inside her like a new heartbeat. She couldn't go through with this. She couldn't barter her soul for survival, not even for her family's sake. The knowledge was terrifying, and yet it was also liberating. Her fingers tightened around the battered seashell hidden in her pocket, a reminder of the girl she had been just days ago, laughing under the Amalfi stars, daring to dream of something more. Movement in the doorway caught her attention. Carmen, flanked by a small army of wedding planners and society matrons, was scanning the terrace, her expression tight with expectation. Natalie's heart gave a sickening lurch. If she hesitated now, even for a second, they would find her, drag her back into the golden cage waiting inside. She had to move. Now. Natalie turned and slipped through the side garden, her heels sinking into the damp earth. The thunderhead of the approaching storm growled low and ominous overhead. Lightning flickered across the sea, illuminating the path before her like a sign she was no longer willing to ignore. She didn't run. Not at first. She walked with steady, determined steps, each one a rebellion against the future laid out for her like a polished noose, past the manicured hedges, past the gleaming white columns, past the gleaming line of luxury cars waiting to ferry guests home. Freedom. It was close. Enough to taste now. A shout rose behind her. Carmen's voice, sharp and panicked, cutting through the humid night. "Natalie, where are you going? Natalie!" She broke into a run. The hem of her silk dress tore on the gravel and her lungs burned, and the rain began in earnest, soaking through the thin fabric and plastering it to her skin. But she didn't stop. She couldn't. She burst through the parking lot gates and out onto the darkened street beyond, her breath ragged, her heart pounding a wild rhythm in her ears. She didn't have a plan, only the unshakable certainty that she couldn't stay. The headlights of a cab appeared out of the mist, and Natalie hurled herself into the street, waving her arms frantically. The driver slowed, swearing under his breath, but she didn't give him time to object. She yanked open the door and tumbled inside, gasping out the first destination that came to mind. The marina. Fast. The cabbie grunted and peeled away from the curb. Natalie slumped back against the seat, her chest heaving, her soaked dress clinging coldly to her skin. The lights of Palm Beach blurred past in a smear of color and motion, and still she felt the echoes of her mother's voice chasing her. "You're throwing everything away. You're being selfish. You're ruining us." Tears burned at the back of her throat, but she forced them down. She wasn't running from her family. She was running toward herself. The marina was nearly deserted when they arrived, the storm scaring off the usual late-night fishermen and tourists. The cabbie gave her a dubious look but said nothing as she thrust a wad of crumpled bills at him and stumbled out into the rain. Boats rocked and groaned against their moorings, sails snapping like restless ghosts. Natalie had no idea what she was looking for, only that somewhere in the tangle of docks and shadows she might find a way forward. A voice called her name. She froze, heart slamming into her ribs. There, running down the dock, drenched to the bone, was Jake. He skidded to a halt in front of her, breathing hard, rainwater dripping from his hair and soaking his suit until he looked less like a billionaire heir and more like the reckless, barefoot boy she had met on the beaches of Italy. "Natalie," he gasped, grabbing her shoulders, grounding her. "Thank God." She stared up at him, disbelieving. "How did you—" He laughed, wild and breathless. "Your mother nearly had a heart attack. I knew where you'd go." Natalie's hands clutched at his jacket without meaning to, anchoring herself to him. "I can't do it," she whispered. "I can't marry you. Not like this." Jake's face crumpled for a heartbeat, grief and relief warring in his eyes. "I know," he said. I don't want you to. The thunder cracked overhead, and the rain fell harder, pelting them with cold, stinging drops. But neither of them moved. I'm not ready, Natalie said, her voice breaking. I'm terrified. Jake cupped her face in his hands, his touch unbearably tender. So am I, he said. But I'd rather spend my life waiting for you than trap you in something you're not ready for. Tears spilled over, mingling with the rain. You deserve better, she choked out. Someone who isn't broken. Jake smiled then, a slow, breathtaking thing that lit up the darkness around them. You're not broken, Natalie. You're alive. Lightning flashed, and for a moment the whole world seemed to hold its breath. Without thinking, Natalie surged forward, pressing her mouth to his. Jake responded instantly, wrapping his arms around her, pulling her against him like a drowning man clinging to a lifeline. The kiss wasn't polished or perfect. It was raw, messy, desperate. It was everything they had been too afraid to say out loud. When they finally pulled apart, both gasping for air, Jake rested his forehead against hers. Come with me, he whispered. Not to a boardroom, not to a mansion, just away. Natalie laughed through her tears. Where? Anywhere. Everywhere. He took her hand and pressed it against his heart. Let's figure it out together. The rain blurred everything around them, but Natalie saw him clearly for the first time. Not as Landon Harlow, the heir apparent. Not as Jake Carter, the surfer. But simply as the man who had waited, who had seen her when no one else had. She squeezed his hand. Okay, she said, her voice steady. Okay? Okay, let's go. They didn't look back. Not at the hotel, not at the life that had been written for them before they had even been old enough to refuse it. Hand in hand, they ran down the dock, laughing and crying and half blind with hope. Ahead of them the world, stretched wide and wild and unknown. And for the first time in her life, Natalie Reid didn't feel like she was running away. She felt like she was finally coming home. The wind tore at Natalie Reid's hair as she stood on the deck of the small ferry, watching the Florida coastline blur into mist behind them. Jake's hand was firm in hers, his thumb tracing slow, grounding circles on the back of her knuckles. The salt spray clung to their skin, the world trembling with motion and promise around them. They had escaped. Against every expectation, every well-laid plan, they had simply said no. No to a life mapped out by other people. No to a future chosen for them. No to fear, and yes to each other. The ferry churned steadily toward a tiny cluster of islands just off the coast, places neither of them had ever been, places without plans or expectations waiting for them. It wasn't glamorous or grand, but it was real, and Natalie had never been more certain that she was exactly where she needed to be. She turned to Jake, studying the way the wind sculpted his hair back from his face, the way his eyes crinkled, at the corners when he smiled at her. Not the polished, impersonal smile she had seen at countless society events, but something raw and true and infinitely more dangerous. What happens now, she asked, her voice nearly lost in the roar of the engine. Jake grinned, tugging her closer so that their bodies bumped together with the movement of the boat. Now we live. It sounded so simple, and yet it was the most radical thing either of them had ever dared. When they arrived at the island, a sleepy place with one dusty main street, a scattering of colorful cottages and a rickety general store, Natalie felt something inside her loosen, something that had been bound so tightly for so long she had almost forgotten it existed. Freedom. Real, terrifying, magnificent freedom. They rented a battered Jeep from a man named Lou who wore flip-flops and a sun-bleached hat and didn't ask questions. They found a room in a weathered inn overlooking the beach, the shutters flapping lazily against the whitewashed walls. That first night they didn't talk much. They sat on the narrow balcony, drinking cheap beer from glass bottles, watching. The sky bleed into 1,000 shades of pink and gold. Natalie rested her head on Jake's shoulder, feeling the quiet thrum of his heart beneath his t-shirt. You okay? He asked softly, his fingers stroking slow patterns on her arm. She nodded, too full of feeling to speak. Jake shifted so that he could see her face, his expression serious in the fading light. You're not alone anymore, Natalie, he said. You don't have to carry everything by yourself. The words broke something inside her, a dam she hadn't even realized she was still holding. Tears spilled over, silent and unstoppable, but Jake just pulled her into his arms and held her as the night folded gently around them. In the days that followed, they learned each other in 1,000 small ways. Jake loved mangoes but hated papayas. He could fix a broken outboard motor with little more than chewing gum and determination. He sang horribly off-key when he thought no one was listening. Natalie, for her part, rediscovered pieces of herself she had thought long dead. She remembered how much she loved the smell of wet earth after a storm, how the feel of cool sand beneath her feet could still make her laugh like a child. She remembered how fiercely she could argue about the merits of different ice cream flavors, how deeply she could care when she wasn't too busy armoring her heart against disappointment. They argued sometimes, over directions, over grocery, lists over which local seafood shack was superior. But even their arguments felt alive, charged with a kind of energy she had never felt in the cold, careful negotiations of her former life. At night, they lay tangled together in the narrow bed, telling each other stories, not the curated, acceptable versions they showed to the world, but the messy, aching truths underneath. Jake told her about the pressure of growing up as Landon Harlow, about the suffocating expectations that had followed him like a shadow since birth, about how he had fled that life, trading boardrooms for beaches, shareholders for sunsets. Natalie told him about the slow erosion of her dreams, about the way duty had crept into her life until she could no longer remember what it felt, like to want something just for herself. They listened. They held space for each other. They healed. One afternoon, a week after they had fled, Natalie stood ankle-deep in the surf, watching Jake wrestle a battered old surfboard onto the waves. He grinned at her, his hair plastered to his forehead, his skin golden from the sun. "Come on," he shouted. "You'll love it." Natalie laughed, shaking her head. "You're insane." Jake paddled out a few yards, then sat up on the board, watching her with a mischievous glint in his eyes. "Maybe," he called, "back. But you're in love with me anyway." The words hit her like a wave, playful, teasing, but laced with something deeper. Natalie felt her heart seize and soar at the same time. She was. God help her, she was. And instead of fear, she felt wonder. Without thinking, she ran into the surf, splashing toward him. Jake whooped in victory, paddling back to meet her halfway. When they collided, it was clumsy and chaotic, water spraying everywhere, laughter echoing off the wide blue sky. Jake caught her around the waist and lifted her onto the board, steadying her with strong hands. She clung to him, laughing so hard she could barely breathe. And when he kissed her, salty and sweet and a little breathless, it felt like sealing a pact written not in paper or ink but in skin and soul. They spent the rest of the afternoon in the water, teaching each other, teasing each other, falling and failing and trying again. By the time the sun dipped into the horizon, painting the world in molten gold, Natalie felt muscles she hadn't used in years aching in protest, but she also felt more alive than she ever had. Back on the shore, they collapsed onto the sand, soaked and exhausted side by side. Natalie turned to Jake, propping herself up on one elbow. "Tell me something," she said. He grinned lazily. "Anything." "Did you know it would be me?" she asked, voice quieter now. "Back in Amalfi. Did you know?" Jake's smile softened into something almost reverent. "I didn't know," he said. "But the second I saw you standing there, so brave and scared and stubborn, I hoped." Natalie's throat tightened. "I'm glad you hoped," she whispered. Jake reached out and tucked a strand of wet hair behind her ear. "I'll always hope for you," he said. Later, as they lay curled together in the small room, Jake pressed a kiss to her temple. "I don't care where we go next," he murmured against her skin. "I don't care what we do, as long as I'm with you." Natalie smiled, feeling the truth of it settle deep in her bones. "Me neither," she said. In the morning, they would talk about logistics, about money, about work, about what it meant to build a life from scratch. They would face challenges, face doubts. But tonight, under the gentle hush of the waves, they had everything they needed. Each other, hope, and the fierce, reckless belief that maybe, just maybe, the best kind of love wasn't the kind that came with contracts and expectations. Maybe it was the kind you chose over and over again in the messy, beautiful chaos of real life. Natalie drifted into sleep with Jake's arms around her, the future unwritten but dazzling in its possibilities. She had thought she was escaping a life that wasn't hers, but what she had really done was run straight into the one she was always meant to have. Months melted into one another on the island, each day threaded with a quiet kind of wonder Natalie Reid had once thought was reserved only for other people, in other lives, Days began with the sun bleeding over the horizon in strokes of orange and coral and ended with stars splattered carelessly across the velvet night sky. It wasn't the life she had been raised to expect. It wasn't grand or perfect. It was messy, spontaneous, endlessly shifting. And it was hers. Natalie and Jake. Still Jake to her, even though the rest of the world might have known him as Landon Harlow. Built a life that defied every expectation they had ever carried. They found work where they could. Jake fixed boats at the marina with his calloused hands and easy smile, while Natalie managed a tiny cafe near the docks, charming tourists and locals alike with her bright laugh and stubborn spirit. Money was tight, sometimes unbearably so, but they made it work with scraped knees and shared dreams, with long conversations over cheap wine and dinners made from whatever they could catch or forage. They were happy, not in the dazzling magazine cover, way she once thought happiness had to look like. Not the kind of happiness that needed to be polished and paraded for others to admire. This was different. This was happiness built from 1,000 small, deliberate choices, choosing each other, choosing themselves, choosing every single day, to keep moving forward even when it would have been easier to fall back into old patterns. There were moments of doubt, of course. Late nights when bills stacked higher than tips, when exhaustion tugged sharp and merciless at their edges. Arguments about nothing and everything. Silent dinners when fear for the future loomed too large to name. But they never let the fear win. They had each other's backs, always, and slowly, carefully, they stitched a new future out of the ragged fabric of the past. One golden afternoon, nearly a year after they had fled Palm Beach, Natalie stood barefoot in the cafe's tiny kitchen, rolling dough between her hands and humming along to the scratchy radio perched precariously on the windowsill. The door creaked open behind her, and before she could turn, Jake's arms wrapped around her waist from behind. She smiled, leaning into him. His skin was warm from the sun, and he smelled of salt water and freedom. "Busy day," he murmured into her neck. She shrugged. "Busier now?" Jake chuckled, the vibration of it low against her spine. "I have something for you," he said, his voice suddenly serious. Natalie turned in his arms, frowning slightly. "What?" Jake pulled a crumpled envelope from the back pocket of his jeans and held it out to her. Suspicious, she wiped her flour-dusted hands on her apron and took it. Inside was a folded piece of paper, creased and worn. She opened it carefully, scanning the neat, precise handwriting. A business license. For a small adventure company, their names listed side by side. Torres and Carter Adventures. She blinked up at him, stunned. You did this?" she whispered. Jake's smile was shy and proud and unbearably beautiful. "I thought maybe it was time," he said. "Time to stop just surviving and start building something bigger." Natalie's throat tightened. "You're serious," she said. Jake reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his touch unbearably tender. "I'm always serious about you," he said. She launched herself into his arms, laughing and crying and scattering flour everywhere. They stumbled backward, nearly knocking over a tray of bread, but neither of them cared. They were building a life together, piece by piece, and this was the next step. That night, they sat on the beach with the new business license between them, and a battered notebook open on Jake's lap. They made lists and scratched out ideas, dreaming aloud under the vast expanse of stars, boat tours, surfing lessons, guided hikes along hidden trails. They wanted to show people what they had found, not just a place, but a way of living. A way of seeing the world that wasn't about status or success, but about connection, to the sea, to the earth, to each other. The next few months were a whirlwind. They scraped together what little savings they had, begged and borrowed what they could from the handful of locals who had become like family. They painted a tiny office by the marina, its walls the color of sea glass, its windows thrown wide to the ocean breeze. They hung a hand-painted sign over the door. Torres and Carter, Adventures, find your own way. It wasn't perfect. There were days they barely broke even. Days when storms rolled in and cancelled tours, when the roof leaked, when the engine on their one precious boat sputtered and died mid-voyage. But there were also days filled with magic. The laughter of tourists catching their first wave. The wide-eyed wonder of a child spotting dolphins for the first time. The quiet, reverent smiles of couples who found something sacred in a sunset shared from the deck of a creaky boat. They were exhausted and exhilarated and entirely alive. And through it all, Natalie and Jake grew, not into some glossy storybooks. version of themselves, but into something real and extraordinary and wholly their own. One evening, after a particularly grueling day spent repairing storm damage to their little office, they collapsed onto the beach, side by side, too tired even to speak. The tide crept closer, lapping at their bare feet, but neither moved. Natalie turned her head to look at Jake, her heart so full it ached. "You ever regret it?" she asked quietly. "Leaving everything behind?" Jake didn't even hesitate. "Not for a second," he said. Natalie smiled, feeling tears prick her eyes. "Me neither," she whispered. Jake rolled onto his side, propping himself. Up on one elbow, his hand found hers in the sand, their fingers tangling together effortlessly. "I have one more surprise," he said, his voice rough with emotion. Natalie's heart skipped. Jake reached into the pocket of his jeans and pulled out a small worn box. For a moment, the world held its breath. He opened it, revealing a simple silver ring, its surface hammered and imperfect and shining like a captured piece of the sea. Natalie gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. Jake's eyes were impossibly tender. "I don't need a ceremony," he said. "I don't need a crowd or a contract. I just need you." Tears spilled freely down her cheeks now, unstoppable. "Will you marry me?" he asked. "Here, like this. Just us. Just now." Natalie laughed through her sobs, nodding so hard she nearly toppled over. "Yes," she cried. "Yes, 1,000 times yes." Jake slid the ring onto her finger, and it fit perfectly, like it had been waiting for her all along. They kissed there in the sand, the world falling away until there was nothing left but the thunder of their hearts and the endless, unbreakable pull of the ocean. Later, wrapped in a blanket beneath the stars, Jake traced lazy patterns on her arm. "You saved me, you know," he said. Natalie shook her head, resting her forehead against his. "You saved me first." And in the years that followed, they kept saving each other over and over again in 1,000 small, miraculous ways. They built not just a business, but a home, a life. And when their family grew, first with a scrappy, one-eyed dog who followed Jake home one stormy night, then with a daughter who arrived screaming and fierce and perfect, they simply expanded the circle of their love, letting it stretch to encompass everything they had once been so afraid to hope for. They still argued sometimes, over finances, over whether a catamaran or a kayak made a better wedding anniversary present. Natalie and Jake's journey reminds us of one profound truth. The most courageous thing we can do is choose ourselves. In a world that constantly tries to script our futures, their story stands as a shining testament to the power of saying no to expectations, no to fear, and yes to love, yes to authenticity, yes to a life we shape with our own hands. Natalie could have spent her life locked in a golden cage, a prisoner of duty and appearances. Jake could have continued wearing the polished mask of someone he was never meant to be. But instead they leapt into the unknown, carrying nothing but faith in themselves and in each other. They chose the rough waters over the safe harbor, the eyeless, unpredictable journey over the well-trodden path. Their love story was not about wealth or status or perfection. It was about trust, about standing beside someone even when the world whispers that you should run, about building a life brick by messy brick with laughter, tears, and relentless hope. Natalie's transformation teaches us that bravery isn't always loud. Sometimes it's a quiet decision made at midnight. Sometimes it's running barefoot into a rainstorm because your heart knows what your mind fears. Real strength is not about pretending you're not afraid. It's about being afraid and choosing to move forward anyway. Jake's devotion shows us that love is not possession or obligation. Love is freedom. Love is creating a safe place for someone to grow, even if it means walking at their pace, even if it means waiting without guarantee. True love doesn't demand perfection. It celebrates the wild, untamed, beautiful imperfections that make each of us unique. Their life together, built not on fairy tales but on fierce daily choices, reminds us that happiness is not found in grand gestures or flawless plans. It is found in the simple, sacred moments. Shared laughter over burnt toast, whispered dreams under the stars, a hand reaching for yours in the darkness. So if you find yourself at a crossroads, unsure whether to leap into the unknown, remember, Natalie and Jake, remember that the life waiting for you beyond fear might be more extraordinary than anything you could have planned. Trust your heart. Take the risk. Choose the wild, messy, breathtaking adventure of living fully, unapologetically, and with love. Thank you for journeying with us through this unforgettable story. If Natalie and Jake's path inspired you, touched your heart, or reminded you of your own courage, we invite you to be part of our community. Please subscribe to our channel to continue supporting stories like this, Stories that celebrate resilience, love, freedom, and the beauty of choosing yourself. Your support means the world to us and gives us the strength to keep creating more heartfelt journeys that inspire and uplift. Let's keep building a world where every story reminds us that we are capable of writing our own beautiful endings. Subscribe now and stay wild. But the arguments always ended the same way, with laughter, with forgiveness, with the quiet fierce certainty that whatever storms came, they would weather them together. Natalie Reid had once believed she was running away from her life. What she hadn't realized was that she was running straight into the arms of everything she had ever needed. Not a perfect life, but a true one. A life chosen freely, fiercely, and forever.